Salvete amici! When we read about the decline of ancient Rome, we often read that after the fall of the Western Roman Empire, the Dark Ages would start in Italy and in Rome. We are led to believe that the splendorous city that Rome had been, and still was to some degree in 476 AD, was now beginning to fade with the collapse of the Western Empire. But I hope I can show you in this video, dear friends of Roman history, that nothing could be further from the truth. In the last video on this topic, I talked about the state of the city in the year 476 AD and showed that in fact the outward appearance of the city was completely intact even as late as 476 AD. The three sacks of the city in the 5th century, as it turns out, did not damage the fabric of Rome itself. The first sack of Rome by the Visigoths in 410, then the second more thorough one in 455 by the Vandals, and the third quite unknown sack when the evil Magister Militum Ricimer and his Germanic soldiers sacked the city in 472 AD, all these three sacks had in fact inflicted little to no damage onto the buildings themselves, as discussed in my second video on this channel. Most of the damage had been inflicted onto the population, and this is when the population of Rome began declining severely. Had the city still had around 500,000 inhabitants by the year 400, the population had fallen to only around 150,000 by the year 476. Also, the sackings had bereft the city of most of its riches. While the public monuments of the Forum, the amphitheaters and temples were still intact in 476, the inside would tell a different story, as many of the precious statues, gold-plated ornaments, and other valuables had been carried off first by Constantine, then by the Visigoths, the Vandals, and even by Ricimer's Germanic soldiers. In this video, I also argued that the abdication of the last Western Roman Emperor Romulus Augustulus, in fact, did not have any impact onto the city of Rome itself. On that fateful day in 476, you would not have witnessed anything changing in the city of Rome. But what happened to Rome after the Western Empire had now ceased to exist? What happened to Rome within the new realm of Odoacer, which officially was still part of the Eastern Roman Empire, but was de facto reigned as a quasi-independent kingdom? And what happened to Rome later under the kingdom of Theodoric? Well, you might be amazed to find that contrary to what is commonly written on this matter in the most often oversimplified form, the Dark Ages did not yet begin in Rome during that time. In fact, Rome experienced a period of stability and even flourished under the kingdom of Theodoric. We shall see that many of the public buildings were restored, and the Germanic kings not only respected the Roman institutions such as the Senate, but even left Rome to be governed as it was during the time of the Western emperors. When the Germanic chieftain Odoacer deposed Romulus Augustus on August 23, 476, the Germanic chieftain took up his residence in Ravenna and let the Roman Senate continue its usual affairs unhindered. We are amazed to see that all the Roman institutions of old were left completely intact by this Germanic king. Neither did he sack or plunder Rome in any way, nor did he inflict damage of any kind onto the population of Rome. Even more so, the Senate would still continue assembling unhindered in Rome, as in the days of the Western Empire. The office of Praefectus Urbi of Rome, the urban prefect, an old office dating back to the time before the Roman Republic, was still occupied. The urban prefect maintained order within the city, acted as a quasi-mayor of the city, had oversight of the officials responsible for drainage of the Tiber, and the maintenance of the city's sewers, as well as its public buildings and monuments, and was also responsible for the provisioning of grain supply for the city's population. It is noteworthy that nothing whatsoever had changed in 476, nor in 480, nor in the following decades. The city of Rome would carry on as if nothing had happened. However, we shall see that from 537 AD onwards, this office would become occupied less and less frequently until it would completely fade around the year 600 AD. Consuls would also still continue to be nominated. Although this high office had long since ceased to exert any real power, it still continued to be regarded as a great honor in the later empire. We find that here also the consuls continued to be appointed by Odoacer in Rome even after 476, as if nothing had changed. The last consul of the West was Decius Paulinus in 534. We can assume that during the reign of Odoacer, from 476 to 493, the city of Rome did not change a lot. In foreign matters, Odoacer seized the opportunity after the death of the legendary Vandal king Geopolitics and reclaimed Sicily in 477, and in 480, after the death of Julius Nepos, he annexed Dalmatia for his kingdom. In 488 then, the Eastern Roman Emperor Zeno, probably having realized that Italy was only part of the empire in name, sought to end the reign of Odoacer. To this end, he assigned the Ostrogoths under their king Theodoric as foederati and promised Theodoric to reign Italy as the emperor's representative. After a quite lengthy war, Theodoric emerged victorious in 493, killing Odoacer with his own hands. And Theodoric would continue the policy of Odoacer in keeping Roman customs and traditions unchanged and leaving the city of Rome to the Romans, as he himself would reside like Odoacer in Ravenna. So what about Rome then? What was the state of the city during that time, and how did the people live? According to current estimates, the city of Rome hovered between 100,000 and 150,000 inhabitants during these times, far less than at its peak of 1 million inhabitants during the High Imperial Age until the mid-4th century, but still by far the largest city in the West. Regarding religion, the old fire of paganism was by now almost fully extinct. We can assume that by this time the percentage of pagans, at least publicly, must have been quite low. The old pagan temples had been closed for over 100 years now. However, it is mentioned that during the time of Theodoric, we could still witness the ancient pagan festival of the Lupercalia being celebrated in Rome. And of course, it would gladden my heart, dear friends of Rome, if you would subscribe to this canalis so that you don't miss any videos on this and similar topics in the future. Gratias agut tibi, amici. On the matter of the Lupercals, we can read in Ferdinand Gregorovius's History of the City of Rome in the Middle Ages, the sanctuary of Lupercal or Pan, the oldest of all others in the city of Rome, was a dark cave at the foot of the Palatine Hill, which contained a statue of the legendary she-wolf that had, according to legend, suckled Romulus and Remus. The Lupercalia had its center in that cave. It was celebrated annually on February 15th, followed by the purification of the city from the influences of evil demons on the 18th. The Luperci, youths who belonged to the festival colleges, unveiled themselves on that day before the eyes of the people without shame, and only covered by an apron made of the skins of sacrificed goats, they ran through the streets from the Lupercal, leather straps in their hands, with which they struck women on the right hand to give them the blessing of fertility. The attachment of the Romans to these oldest national customs was so great that even as Christians they refused to leave them. So we can see that even though Christianity had abolished the old pagan rites, paganism was so fundamentally entrenched within the citizens of Rome that we could witness this pagan festival of Lupercalia carried out as late as the early 500s in Rome. In the year 500, Theodoric, the king of the Ostrogoths, visited Rome. The Roman statesman Magnus Aurelius Cassiodorus Senator, commonly known as Cassiodorus, wrote about Theodoric's laws, the monuments of Rome, and what transpired during that time, so that we can visualize the state of the city during the early 500s. When Theodoric arrived in Rome, Cassiodorus wrote he was welcomed like a second Trajan. He put up his residence in the old palace of the Caesars on the Palatine Hill, which during that time was still completely intact, although on the inside it had been robbed of most of its valuables during the 3 sacks of the 5th century. If you would have stood in the Forum Romanum in the year 500 while Theodoric was there, you would have seen the king in the Curia Julia, the Senate building, where many senators, and among them the senator Boetius, would have delivered a panegyric to the king. You would have witnessed a speech by Theodoric in which he vowed to upkeep the laws of the old emperors and not to change any Roman customs. In fact, like Majorian some 40 years earlier, Theodoric would enact laws to punish any destruction of public buildings in his entire realm and to prevent the gathering of spolia, a practice where old buildings or statues from the imperial age would be looted for building material in order to erect new buildings, such as churches or private dwellings. When we look back today upon Rome and wonder how Rome was transformed from this to this, we unjustly fully blame the Germanic invaders for the damage inflicted. However, Theodoric proves that these very barbarians sought to protect what the Romans themselves would not. Theodoric therefore tasked the vigiles, the ancient firefighters of Rome, to patrol the streets at day and at night and to take special care regarding the ancient buildings and statues with the order to stop any looters from harming them. The Goths preserving the old splendor of Rome with the utmost zeal, another fascinating, unexpected story as can only be written by history. We shall see in future videos that in fact by far the largest damage to the old splendorous monuments had been done by the Romans themselves, with ever increasing disregard for the beauty of antiquity. And this practice of looting for building material, called spolia, done by the Romans themselves, who in their utter degeneracy had no sense of awe and wonder left for the old monuments of their own forefathers, would be what destroyed the fabric of the old city ever more rapidly in the following century. Cassiodorus's writings are a true treasure trove of information as to the state of the city in the early 6th century. So what would you have seen, for example, in the year 500 or even as late as 536 if you would have walked through the streets of Rome? The many plunderings the city had to endure, the robbings of Constantine. Yes, friends, Constantine robbed Rome of many statues and other valuables to carry them off to his Nova Roma in the east. The robbings by the Visigoths, the plunderings by the Vandals, the sack of Ricimer, all these had not managed to deplete the city of the thousands and thousands of statues that had adorned Roma. Standing in the Forum, we thus would be amazed to see, even as late as 536, shortly before Belisarius would enter the city and the disaster of the Gothic wars would start, that the Forum Romanum was still absolutely intact, even though the color of the painting must have already faded, and some of the statues most likely had already started to crumble. Yet still, you would have seen the temple of the Divus Julius, the temple of Saturn, the Tabularium. You would have seen the temple of Pollux and Castor, the Curia Julia, the Rostra Augusti. To the sides, you would have seen the Basilica Julia and the Basilica Aemilia, all still intact. The gigantic Basilica of Maxentius, that was one of the last buildings of ancient stature to be finished in the Forum around 320 AD, would be still standing completely intact, awing its visitors with its gigantic halls and display of old imperial might. The giant temple of Venus and Roma that had been built by Hadrian would be standing erect and undamaged from the outside. However, since the pagan cults had been abolished in Rome by Theodosius after his victory at the Frigidus River in 394, the temple was barren and desolate on the inside. The Colossus would still be standing near the Amphitheatrum Flavium, which itself was also completely intact. However, of course, gladiatorial games would not be held anymore. The last games of this kind took place in 403, over 100 years earlier. The Amphitheatrum Flavium today bears the name of the Colossus, which stood nearby. Yet it was completely intact, and the spolia had not yet begun here. In fact, it was restored as late as 508 under the Praefectus Urbi Decius Marius Venantius Basilius, after it had been damaged by an earthquake. Even though the gladiatorial games had been abolished over 100 years earlier, we would still witness animal hunts from time to time, as the Venatores, the animal hunters, would still fight wild beasts in the arena on some occasions. For example, in 519, when Eutharic, the son-in-law of Theodoric, came to Rome with great pomp to celebrate his consulship, he gave the people of Rome panem et circenses like in the old times, and we would have seen wild and exotic animals from Africa being hunted by the poor Venatores, who quite often would not survive the bloody spectacle. We can see that the old traditions of Rome would not go easily. Looking back to the Forum, you would see the temple of Jupiter Optimus Maximus still towering above all others, like an ever-present reminder of the pagan days, taunting the Romans that giving up the old beliefs brought ruin upon them. We are pretty amazed to find Cassiodorus talking about a very large number of statues, especially equestrian statues, still adorning the city in many places, despite the degenerate and impoverished population trying their very best to secretly loot these statues for building material. Yet the vigiles would prevent the most damage, so that the splendor of Rome would still shine forth like a radiant light amidst the ever-growing darkness which would soon also reach Italy. We can read about Theoderic's admiration for Rome. Rome, who is ungrateful to no one, since she is no stranger to anyone, the fertile mother of eloquence, the immeasurable temple of all virtues, and which summarizes in itself all the praised wonders of the world, so that in truth it could be said that all of Rome is a single miracle. Under Theoderic's reign, the Praefectus Urbi would even repair damaged buildings, and in this time the Aurelian walls were being repaired and restored. The same care was given to the old aqueducts that had provided the city with fresh water for hundreds of years. As late as 536, you would thus still find all the aqueducts intact, and the public baths would still be in working order. The giant baths of Diocletian, of Caracalla, of Constantinus, they would be open and in working order, and although robbed of some statues and adornments like the other buildings in the sackings, they would still be frequented by the Romans on a regular basis. Strolling further through the city to the Theater of Pompey, we would have seen it still standing unchanged since over 500 years. It had been restored under Honorius in 403 and then again under Theodoric. The senator Quintus Aurelius Symmachus was given the task by the king of the Goths to restore the old amphitheater. This old building must have been quite impressive, as Cassiodorus exclaimed when describing it, "What thou art not dissolving, O old age, since thou wast able to shake so many a great thing." Going further to the foot of the Palatine Hill, you would have seen the old palace of the Caesars standing still intact, since Theodoric had assorted 200 pounds of gold yearly for its restoration and care. Theodoric himself resided in the old palace while in Rome, and we would see the old palace of the Caesars being used as late as the early 570s, when Narses himself would take up residence in this old giant building, after having defeated the very Goths that had protected the old monuments. However, on the inside, the old palace must have been in large parts barren and bereft of all splendorous adornments. You would have found the Circus Maximus intact, even though old age started to show. We can read in Gregorovius' history of the city of Rome in the Middle Ages. The thinned people of Rome no longer filled the elliptical floors since a long time, because 150,000 or 200,000 seats could not be occupied by the Roman citizens of that time. When Trajan gave his games there, this gigantic building would not even be sufficient for the needs of the city. No Roman would have believed that the time would come when the Circus had become too big for the entire population of Rome. Yes, where the entire people of this city could sit comfortably on the fourth part of the rows of seats. It was around the year 500 that some of the marble seats were already in disrepair, some parts of the portico had been damaged, the shops outside standing empty and abandoned, and of the statues that Septimius Severus once placed there, the Vandals probably had dragged many away, and others stood mutilated in the booths. The Circus was old and weathered, and the whole gigantic structure, worn out through centuries of use, changed in its character, in color and appearance of old age, similar to the nearby imperial palaces, from which it was only separated by a street. But it was still in full use. Even as late as 536, shortly before the Gothic wars would plunge Rome into darkness, you would have seen chariot races taking place in the old Circus Maximus. In fact, there was a frequent exchange of chariot races between Constantinople and Rome, as sometimes charioteers from one team had to flee Constantinople for Rome when the games would get too heated, as was often the case in the hippodrome of the city of Constantine. The last chariot races in the Circus Maximus would be held by Totila in 549, but that is a story for a different time. If you would have strolled further to the magnificent Forum Trajanum, the Forum of Trajan, you would have found it completely intact. Cassiodor writes ecstatically, "The Forum of Trajan is a miracle, no matter how long one admires it, and whoever climbs up the sublime capital will see a work that is above human genius." It is thus with utter disbelief and fascination that we would have seen almost all of the old monuments of Rome still standing decades after the supposed fall of the Western Roman Empire. This was the state of the city of Rome in the early 6th century, and we can assume that it was also the state of the city when Belisarius entered Rome on December 9th, 536. During the reign of Theodoric, but also under the Ostrogothic successor kings of Theodoric, we saw that great care had been taken to preserve not only the old societal structures, rites and the Roman way of life, but also to preserve the ancient buildings of this, in that time, still very spectacular city. When Belisarius and his Eastern Roman army entered Rome, The historian Procopius of Caesarea accompanied the Eastern Roman Magister Militum, and from his writings we get other fascinating glimpses of the condition of the city during these times. Procopius, for example, writes that he was surprised to find people driving cattle through some of the forums of Rome, and he gives one detailed account of such an occurrence. A herd of cattle came into Rome in the late evening from the country through the forum which the Romans call the Forum of Peace, for in that place has been situated from ancient times the Temple of Peace, which was struck by lightning. And there is a certain ancient fountain before this forum, and a bronze bull stands by it, the work, I think, of Pheidias the Athenian or of Lysippus. For there are many statues in this quarter which are the works of these two men. This is a fascinating account that details the utter contrast we would have witnessed in this time, where some parts of the city would have already been in neglect, as certainly Theodoric's restorations could not have applied to the whole city, because the city was so immensely large with its 25 square kilometers of surface area. It was by surface area still the largest city in the world in these times. Yet since the population had shrunk, as we heard before, to some 100,000 or maximum 150,000 inhabitants, some more outwards lying areas of the city would have started to fall into neglect. According to Procopius, the Templum Pacis, the Temple of Peace, and the surrounding area seems to have been such a place where cattle would be driven through. Procopius also describes the temple of Jupiter Optimus Maximus and notes that it had not been repaired from the damage inflicted by the Vandals 81 years earlier. They had stripped the temple of its gilded roof, and since then the temple of Jupiter Optimus Maximus had stood there empty, barren, and without roof. Procopius also describes the temple of Janus at the foot of the Capitoline Hill, at the entrance to the Forum Romanum, and describes how people had tried to break the entrance open, since it had been an old custom during the imperial age to open the temple in times of war and close it in times of peace. And as war had now descended upon Rome with the entrance of the Eastern Romans, the old traditions demanded the gates open. This is another instance where we would have been amazed to find the population of Rome practicing old pagan beliefs as late as 536, despite 200 years having passed since Constantine and 140 years having passed since Theodosius' abolishment of the pagan rites. Old traditions do not die easily. Procopius also describes the mausoleum of Hadrian as completely intact. It would later become the place of a heated battle between the Romans and the Goths, as we shall soon discuss in future videos on the Gothic Wars. This is where the light of Rome that had shone brightly for over 1,000 years would finally be extinguished. Although Procopius had a negative view of the Romans, accusing them of abandoning their old martial values and allowing themselves to be ruled by the Goths, he still sometimes shows admiration for the Romans, as he for example wrote, "The Romans love their city above all men that we know, and they are eager to protect all the ancestral treasures and to preserve them, so that nothing of the ancestral glory of ancient Rome may be obliterated. For even though they were for a long period under barbarian sway, they preserved the buildings of the city and most of the adornments, such as they could, through the excellence of their workmanship, withstand so long a lapse of and such neglect." This is a fascinating contrast to the accounts of Cassiodorus, in which we found that Theodoric had mourned the practice of the Romans who had descended to such degeneracy that they would damage statues and buildings for looting of building materials, and in which great care had to be taken to protect the ancient monuments from its own citizens. We can assume that the truth lies somewhere in between, as is most often the case. Another interesting description of Procopius is his detailed account of the ship of Aeneas, the legendary founder of Rome, who according to legend had fled from the destruction of Troy and had laid the foundation of Rome. We are amazed to find this ship of Aeneas completely intact when Procopius was in the city after December 9th, 536. It is thus with great surprise and fascination, at least for me, and I hope for you too, dear friends of Roman history, that we find the city of Rome as late as 536 in a surprisingly good condition of outward appearance. While it is clear that the population had shrunk since the zenith of Rome's splendor some 200 years earlier, it is still incredible to see Rome preserved to such an extent after its supposed fall. We must thus question this supposed fall of the West, since the flame of Roma had not been extinguished in 476, and in fact it continued to shine, not quite as brightly anymore, but yet still very much visible for another 60 years after the Western Empire was no more. I will make many more videos on the state of the city of Rome from its zenith, where it reached its full extent in 320 AD, to the early Middle Ages in the 7th century, after the catastrophic Gothic wars. We shall also analyze the sites, monuments, population density and topography of Rome during its peak, and we shall even compare the old Rome to the new Rome, the Nova Roma, the city of Constantine in the east, and how Constantinople changed over the course of history, as we do not want to neglect the Eastern Roman Empire. I would be very happy if you would accompany me on this journey, dear friends of Rome, and bene vale amici.